Hey everyone, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. So today we're going to look at this device here. It's called the PowKiddy A20. And this seems to be an evolution of a device that's already been released previously, called the PowKiddy A19. And there are other versions of that device floating around. For example, the Retroid Pocket 1 is also another famous example. But this one has a few upgrades to it. For example, it has a new design language which seems to be reminiscent of the Analog Pocket. And they've also made some pretty good upgrades to the chip inside as well, so now it has better performance. And I spent a few days with this device, and at face value, initially I thought I could make just a quick 10-minute review. And in that review, I was basically going to say what it can and cannot do and how to navigate around the menus. But as I dug a little bit deeper, I realized there was a little bit more to this device than what you would see when you first turn it on. And so this is going to be a pretty deep dive review. Not only am I going to show you what this device can initially do, but I'm going to show you all the different things you can unlock depending on how much effort you want to put into the device itself. Because at the end of the day, this is a device you could pick up and play, but the more time you invest into it, the more you're going to get out of it. And so I'm going to walk you through that whole spectrum here in this video. And of course, like with many other PowKiddy products, there are good and bad with this device, and it's really going to come down to whether or not the good outweighs the bad. So buckle up, grab your favorite drink and maybe a snack, and let's dig in. Okay, let's start with the specs. This runs an S905D3 chipset. This is a quad-core CPU that runs at a base clock of 1.9 GHz. It also comes with 2 gigs of RAM and 8 gigs of internal storage. It has a 3000 mAh battery, which seems to get about 3 or 4 hours, nothing like the 6 hours that you may be used to with other devices. As far as display, it's 3.5 inches with a resolution of 640 by 480 and an aspect ratio of 4:3. And while it is an IPS display, it's not laminated, and I'll show you more about that later in the video. As far as connectivity, it has internal Wi-Fi, Bluetooth 5.0, and HDMI out. And like with the previous generation of devices that had the same design language, things like the Retroid Pocket 1, it has 6 face buttons here on the front, and then this one also has 2 shoulder buttons on the back. Okay, let's do a quick unboxing. You know, PowKiddy is known for having very plain boxes, and as you can see, this one is just like the others. Inside, you're going to find a USB-C cable, as well as a very short instruction manual. So let's get to the device itself. First impressions of this device is that it has that same rubber coating, which is found on the PowKiddy RGB10 Max. And unfortunately, it picks up fingerprints like crazy. As you can see here, I literally took it out of the box, and it still has fingerprints all over it from when they packaged this together. And unfortunately, there's no real way to get rid of all these fingerprints. The design itself is pretty blocky. You can see it's a little bit rounded around the edges, but not much. On the bottom here, you can see a USB-C charging port, as well as a microSD card slot. And inside mine came with a 64 gig microSD. One thing to note here, this little covering that covers the microSD card slot is really kind of a pain in the butt to get back into place. It's just a little bit too big for that slot. Okay, let's talk about buttons for a minute. Every single button on this device is very clicky. None of these use a rubber membrane connection, which means that they're going to be very stiff. Same thing with the D-pad. This doesn't have a lot of travel, and it clicks down when you push down on it. And personally, when you're playing retro games, I'm not a big fan of this experience. I would say this D-pad is not the worst thing in the world. There's a little bit of travel there, but all the same, I wish they had used the D-pad that you can find on other devices like the RGB10 or even the Anbernic devices. It's just a really clicky and stiff experience. It's not going to be very easy on your hands. Now this has a Switch-style analog stick, which unfortunately is not recessed, so it sticks out quite a bit from the box, and it also does not click down, so this doesn't function as an L3 button. And like with the D-pad, these face buttons are very clicky as well. They have a little bit of travel to them, but altogether I would say these are also very stiff. They remind me a lot of the clicky buttons that you would find on a Nintendo Switch. And when you put that all together, it creates a very loud experience. This is not a device I would recommend playing in bed next to your significant other. It's going to be really loud. Just listen to it here. So yeah, overall I would say the control scheme is serviceable, but in no way excellent. Alright, let's take a look at this screen for a minute. Now, like I mentioned, this display is not OCA laminated. That means there's a little bit of a gap between the glass at the front of the device as well as the display itself. It's kind of hard to see right here, but I'll show you more when the device is actually turned on. On the back, you can see it has 2 shoulder buttons, the micro HDMI out, a headphone jack, as well as a reset button. Now this device only comes in one color, and as you can see here, it looks very similar to the yet-to-be-released Analog Pocket device. And honestly, it's not a bad design, it's very eye-catching. But I think the best comparison is going to be a device that already exists, and so let's look at the RG351V from Anbernic. And I would say these two devices are about the same size, but if you see here, the triggers are actually a lot higher on the PowKiddy device than the Anbernic one. And it seems to be a little bit thinner and obviously not as rounded. Of course, the RG351V has both shoulders and triggers, and also has a different design when it comes to the face buttons, as well as the placement of the analog stick and the D-pad. Additionally, the RG351V has a recessed analog stick, which makes it quite a bit more pocketable than the PowKiddy A20. The analog stick on the A20 will catch in your pocket when you try to slide it in. Okay, let's start it up and see what it's like. Now, this is an Android 9 based device, which means it's going to take a while to boot up. As you can see here, about 30 seconds, which actually is not too terrible when it comes to an Android device. Now, the first thing I noticed when turning it on is this single mono speaker here at the bottom and back of the device. The placement's a little bit weird, and the audio itself is not too great. It's loud, but it doesn't have a lot of bass. So now let's talk about the software interface here. They're calling it the PowKiddy box, and it looks a lot like a Pandora's box replica. And within here, they have a bunch of preloaded games that have really bad translations to them. For example, Captain Commando is called Famous General, and Alien vs. Predator is called Blood Type. And while I appreciate that each of these are organized by system, and it's fairly easy to navigate through these using the shoulder buttons, but all the same, it's kind of a confusing experience to navigate through these things and see game names like Banjo Bear Adventure. And so in that sense, I wouldn't consider this to be a pick up and play device. This isn't something that you're just going to be able to buy and start playing right out of the gate. If you do want to get your favorite games on here and be able to find them when they are on here, you're going to have to add them yourself. I'll show you how to do that later in this video, but I wanted to make you aware of how this experience is going to be like when you first start up the system. So now let's start up a game and see how that experience is. We'll start with the arcade version of Final Fight. And as you can see here, it takes a little bit less than 7 seconds to boot up the game itself. As far as controls, everything seems to be working okay. You can use either the D-pad or the analog stick. And here's a look at that non-laminated screen. As you can see, there's a little bit of gap between the glass and the display itself. And it's really not that noticeable, but it will create a lot of reflections when you're trying to play that game. And so basically, it's going to have some pretty bad viewing angles. In terms of brightness, it's actually fairly bright. As you can see here, it looks pretty good out in direct sunlight. So honestly, not the worst display in the world. It's actually pretty good despite not being laminated. Okay, let's talk about the menu for a second. Not a lot going on here. You can exit the game, or you can set up a save state. And there's a couple other options. You can set up cheats if you'd like. You can also set up network play to play against a friend or with a friend if you have the same device. And there's a little bit about key mapping. We'll get into that here in a couple minutes. And honestly, starting up a game is kind of a bit like a lottery. For example, you might find a game called Zombie Revenge on the Dreamcast. You might think, okay, is that Resident Evil? What is that game? But then it might turn out to actually be a game called Zombie Revenge. So sure enough, yeah, there actually is a game on the Dreamcast called Zombie Revenge. I didn't know that until right now. So there's a little bit of fun with that. They have these random games loaded on here, and there's a bit of a discovery with that too. Now, if you want to add your own games, you can actually do that directly onto the device. What you need to do is set up your Wi-Fi and then go into the main menu and then select Enter Game Market. And within here, you're going to find a very simple marketplace organized by system, which will allow you to go in and download any games that you can find. But 2 quick points here. Number 1, this is super shady, and number 2, these games are also poorly translated. For example, if we go into the CPS2 section, it's very hard to figure out what game is what. There's one here called Cartoon Hero. We'll download this one and see what it's like. And maybe a third point too is the fact that many of these system markets actually don't even work. For example, you can't download anything on Nintendo 64, it just gives you an error. But yeah, this is what that marketplace looks like. Once it's been downloaded, you can find the game in the main menu. For example, here's the Cartoon Hero game, which actually turns out to be Marvel superheroes. Now at first glance, you might think that this system would be perfect for Street Fighter style games like this one. Because it has these 6 face buttons, you would expect it to correspond to light, medium, and heavy hits. But unfortunately, the buttons are not mapped that way in the software. You have to use the shoulder buttons like you would with any other device. And so if you go into the game menu, then game settings, you actually have the ability to change the button mapping. The problem is this button mapping software is basically broke. For example, many of the buttons are going to register as the A button, even if you're pushing something like the L shoulder button. And then when you try to save it, it's actually not going to save your button mapping. So in the end, with this stock software experience, you're actually going to be stuck with the button mapping that they have here. And unfortunately, it's not ideal for these style of games, which is just super ironic given the fact that this is the one type of game that would probably work best with this device. Okay, since the game marketplace is kind of a bust, let's try adding our own games to the SD card. So we're going to pull it out here and put it into my computer. So on the card, there's a game folder, and within that, there's a data folder. And in here, we're going to find all the preloaded games they had in the menu. So theoretically, you could clean these out and get rid of them, and then add your own games here. Now to add your own games, it's a little bit different. You wouldn't put them in the data folder, instead you would put them in the download folder. And I know that's a little bit weird, but that's just how the system is set up. But basically, you could add whatever games you wanted to the main menu by adding them to these download folders. So I've already gone ahead and added some of my own personal games to these download folders, and so now let's try it out on the device itself. Okay, once you have the device loaded up, you're going to go into the main menu, then go into Enter Game Settings, and then External Games Management. And all the games that you put in the download folder are going to pop up here. And all you have to do at this point is press the X button, and it's going to load all of them into the main menu. And there you go, when you back out to the main menu, you're going to find all the games that you added yourself. And they'll be organized by system based on what folder you put them in. So yeah, I would say that this is probably the most basic thing you can do to improve the experience on this game, is that you can add your own ROMs to it. But there's quite a few other things we can do too. For example, we could upgrade the micro SD card on this device to be a little bit more reliable and have some more space to it as well. So let's take a deeper look at the original SD card. If we use an app called Disk Genius, we can see it has one single partition and it's FAT32 formatted, which essentially means that all we have to do is drag and drop the contents of the original SD card into our new SD card, as long as it's been formatted to FAT32. So first things first, I'm going to make a backup of the original SD card. I'm basically going to move everything over except for the data folder from the original games folder. That means I'm basically moving over just the structure as well as the games that I added to the downloads folder a few minutes ago. Then we can just go ahead and make a new blank data folder, and then I'm going to go in and delete all those games I had added to the downloads folder earlier, and then let's compare the folder structure between the downloads and the data folder. As you can see here, they're basically the same. The downloads folder has subfolders for Nintendo DS as well as DOS games. And so I think what I'm going to do here is just copy over the folder structure from the downloads folder into the new data folder. So I'm basically just duplicating the empty folders here. So essentially at this point, we've taken everything we need from the original SD card, we can eject it and put in that new SD card. And I'll have a walkthrough for all this in my written guide in the video description. I know I'm going pretty fast with it, but I just want to make sure that you understand the process. Now with this new SD card, what we need to do is format it to FAT32. There's a specific program we need to use called GUIFormat.exe. Again, this will all be in my written guide. And all we have to do here is just format this new SD card. And there we go, we now have 128 gigs of a FAT32 SD card. So now I'm going to go over and grab that backup folder that I just created. I'm going to move it all over into the new SD card. And in my written guide, I've gone ahead and made a blank folder structure for you, so you can just download that and then move it over to your new SD card. Anyway, all you have to do after you've moved over everything into your new micro SD card is open up the games folder, and then add your BIOS files as well as all your games to the download subfolder. So I'm going to do that here real quick. I'm just going to start picking systems and moving these ROMs over into the downloads folder. And it's a pretty easy process here, it's literally just drag and drop. But once you've moved over all your games, let's go ahead and get them working on the device itself. Now once you put that new SD card into your device, it's still going to show all the old games that you had on there previously. So what we need to do is clean out the current games list and then add all of our new games. So in the main menu, go into Enter Game Settings, and then select Edit Games List. Here we want to push the C button to remove all games. This is going to remove the entire file structure that we had previously on the old SD card. And this will take a couple minutes to delete the games list, but at that point the system is going to consider itself to be basically blank. So now what we want to do is load up all of those games that we previously put on this new SD card. And this is exactly the same process that we did previously with the couple other games that we added. We're going to go into External Games Management and then press the X button to add all of these games to the menu. Again, this is going to take a couple more minutes, but once you're done, you can now go back into the main menu and you'll have all of your new games listed. So essentially, if you wanted to load up your own personal game collection, this is how you would do it. You would use a new SD card, you would put the old file structure in there, load up all of your games, and then load them into the menu. Okay, so now that we've loaded up all of our own games, let's actually start talking about the performance of this device itself. We'll start from easy to hard. Okay, starting with Game Boy, you can see that everything's stretched out to the full screen itself. And that's a good and bad thing. It's not going to scale perfectly, but all the same, you actually have no options to change any of the visual settings. There's a couple filters you can apply. For example, they have one called HQ, which is basically a scale to X filter. And they also have one called bilinear, which actually is just a scanline filter. And so those are the only two things you can actually do to the game image itself. And so because of that, I basically just leave it on the default settings. And most of the games do look pretty good. As you can see here, Game Boy Color looks really nice. They do apply a bilinear filtering on everything, so everything is going to be a little bit soft looking, but all the same, the pixelation looks pretty good. It will get a little bit frustrating for some of the pixel purists. For example, Game Boy Advance has been squished to a 4:3 display and there's no way to change it to the original 3:2 aspect ratio. But in general, your typical classic consoles that ran at a 4:3 aspect ratio, things like Nintendo and Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo, they're all going to look pretty good. Like I mentioned, they all run with a bilinear filter, so they're a little bit soft looking, but all the same, it's not a bad experience. If you're looking to just play classic systems like this, it's a very simple menu. But if you're somebody who likes to tinker around and mess with settings, this is not going to give you any options at all. You can basically just load up a game, do a save state, and maybe change a filter if you'd like. Now, moving up to harder systems, things like PlayStation 1 actually play perfectly, no issues here. But things do get a little bit dicey with Nintendo 64. Unfortunately, I have no idea what emulator is running here, and there's no option to make any adjustments to that either. On top of that, there's no way to show frame rate or anything else, so I can't tell you how good this is actually performing. I will say that overall, most of these games run relatively smoothly, but when you start playing things like Cruisin' USA or Mario Tennis or GoldenEye 007, all of them are going to be significantly laggy. And best case scenario here, I would say you can probably play 75% of Nintendo 64 games relatively smoothly, and the other ones are going to have some significant audio stuttering or lag. Now surprisingly, PSP performs way better than Nintendo 64 on this device. Again, I have no idea what the frame rate is here, but it does look like it's running at a 2x resolution, and it does look pretty sharp. That being said, PSP is a 16:9 system, and so it looks a little bit squished on this 4:3 display with only 3.5 inches of screen real estate. And again, I have no idea what emulator is running here, and I can't see the frame rate, but all the same, the games are running smoothly. In fact, even the God of War games are playing pretty well. These typically are almost impossible to emulate, but with this upgraded chipset, you're actually getting some pretty good performance. I would say it's about 90% full speed. And as far as I can tell, this is actually not running with frameskip at all. So at the end of the day, PSP is a very pleasant and surprising experience. Now, the only other heavy-duty system that can play on this is actually Sega Dreamcast, and unfortunately this one plays really poorly. Despite not being able to see the frame rate, I can tell you right now that even something like Crazy Taxi 2 is only running at about 3/4 speed. And so if you want to play some really light games, it might be possible, but anything heavy like Dead or Alive 2 or Crazy Taxi 2, they're just not going to be a very enjoyable experience. In fact, the stock Dreamcast experience is actually worse than it is on RK3326 devices running something like 351 ELEC or ArcOS. So this device has a micro HDMI out port, so let's test that out and see how it works. And unfortunately, this is a little bit half-baked. When I first started it up, it seemed to work okay, but once it got into the menus, it turned into this weird red and black coloring here. And I tried several different cables, as well as different plugins and monitors, and every single time I got this red screen instead. So unfortunately, at least for my unit, HDMI is broken right out of the box. And another thing that's frustrating about this device is because I don't know which emulator is running, it's very hard to get arcade games to work properly. And that's because I don't know which ROM set to use, because I don't know which core is being loaded. So when it comes to MAME, I have no idea. It's not MAME 2003 Plus, I can tell you that, but other than that, I'm not really sure what they're running. And so when it comes to arcade, which arguably would be one of the best systems to play on this because of the 6 buttons, it's a really compromised experience. Not only can you not map the buttons properly, but I don't know which ROM set to load either. Now, loading up your own media is actually pretty easy. All you have to do is drop in image files or video files, and you have to make sure that the name matches the name of the ROM as well. And the system will actually pick up on it automatically, and so you can either navigate using the images or the videos. You can't show both at once. If you put both of them in the same folder, it's only going to show the video file. But all told, it's actually a very easy way of adding your own media. Okay, so that's the stock experience, but the thing is, this thing runs on Android, and there is a way to run Android apps on it. What you want to do is go into the menu and then enter the Android apps list. And it's going to give you a few options here, and a lot of these don't work. For example, if you try to run the Google Play Store, it actually just crashes. But there is a file management app. So what you can do is load up Android apps onto your SD card and then install them via this file management app. And then once you have those apps on the device, you can just go ahead and open them up and then point them to the same folders that have all of your games that we added previously. And as you may know, navigating Android without a touchscreen is a pain in the butt, but luckily the USB-C port in the bottom actually works as an OTG port, so you could plug in a USB keyboard and then navigate things that way. But then once it's all set up, you actually can use standalone emulators like Movement 64 here. And these standalone emulators run a lot better than the stock ones that are built with the system. For example, here's Nintendo 64 running F-Zero with no problems. Same thing with Mario Tennis. It has a little bit of stuttering when it comes to the replay sections, but otherwise the gameplay is super smooth running at full speed. So this to me is like that third level of gameplay experience. The first level is just adding your own games. The second level is adding your own micro SD card and curating it to your own experience. And then the third level here is to actually add your own standalone emulators. Now this doesn't make every game run at full speed. For example, I would say Cruisin' USA and GoldenEye still have a little bit of lag to them, but overall I would say this unlocks about 95% of the entire Nintendo 64 catalog to play at full speed. And so in that sense, I think the standalone emulator is totally worth it. Another standalone emulator that works really well is the PSP emulator. Now with each of these, you're going to have to go in and remap all of your buttons, and you'll have to adjust the graphics settings and things like that, but you also have the control to be able to do these kind of things for each game. And so we can see here with PSP running at a 2x resolution and no frame skip, it still does run at 100% full speed. You'll get dips every once in a while, but for the most part, PSP is really good on this device. In fact, when it comes to PSP performance, this is the best that you can find on the market right now, around the $100 price point. Even something like God of War can play at 2x resolution with no frame skip and running at about 95 to 100% full speed. That's really impressive. Now unfortunately, Dreamcast performance is not as good as it is on the PSP. Here I'm using the standalone Redream emulator, and some games will play pretty well. For the most part, 2D fighting games and some of the lightweight racing games, they're going to play just fine. But when you start upping the ante and trying to play some of the harder to run games, they're not going to run well at all. As you can see here, Crazy Taxi 2 struggles to get beyond 50 frames per second. And unfortunately, the other good standalone Dreamcast emulator, Flycast, actually won't install on this system. So unfortunately, you're just kind of stuck with pretty bad Dreamcast performance on this device. Now, in addition to standalone emulators, you can also install RetroArch on this device. And this is going to be a really great solution for some of the older systems, things like 8-bit and 16-bit systems. And gameplay on this is really good as well. The chip is more than powerful enough to play all of these systems, no problem. But it also will give you the ability to do things like scaling and show your frame rate and things like that. And so this is going to give you a little bit more options when it comes to tinkering. And not only that, you can then determine which arcade core you want to use so you can use the matching ROM set. And on top of that, in RetroArch, it's very easy to map the buttons. So now, finally, you can actually use the 6-button layout the way it was intended to be used. And so when it comes to arcade gameplay, it's basically broken on the stock operating system, but you can fix all of that in RetroArch. Now unfortunately, RetroArch struggles to keep up with some of the harder systems. For example, when I try to use the Flycast core within RetroArch, I actually get worse performance than I do with Redream. So just overall, Dreamcast is not going to be very good on this device. And one that's really frustrating is Sega Saturn. If you use the standalone Yabasan Shiro emulator, it actually runs at basically full speed. The problem is you can't actually map the buttons. It doesn't register the inputs in the menu at all. And so that's kind of frustrating. And you can play it on RetroArch, but unfortunately it's unplayably slow. And given the fact that we're getting pretty good performance here, you might think, well, can it play GameCube? And unfortunately, none of the GameCube emulators, Dolphin, MJR 1 and 2, none of them actually can install on the system. So when it comes down to it, no, you can't play GameCube on this, at least with this current operating system. Now, in addition to using standalone emulators, you can actually use something like ATV Launcher to be your default launcher for the device too. So when you power on the device, instead of seeing that weird Pandora's box interface, you could actually just see this one instead. And to me, this one looks a lot better. And even further, you could use something like Launchbox to organize all of your emulators and games into one user interface. And so now, instead of having to navigate to the standalone emulators to launch a game, you could actually just set everything up through Launchbox to navigate it this way. Now this does take quite a bit of time to get set up initially. I would say it took me about half a day to figure out how to make all of this work. But once you have it all going, it's pretty easy to jump in and out of your games and have this kind of unified experience. That being said, the Launchbox experience is still quite new and buggy. For example, the menu you see on the left is the exact same as the phone on the right. But unfortunately, it's impossible to read on the PowKiddy A20. So I actually had to use this phone to look at the menus at the same time as my PowKiddy to make sure I was selecting the right features as I was going through everything. And that's kind of a crappy workaround, but fortunately you only have to do it one time. So yeah, unless they make a new custom firmware, something like Lineage OS available for the PowKiddy A20, I would recommend using standalone emulators like you see here. Okay, we've been at this for quite some time now. Let's go ahead and get into what I actually think about the device. We'll start with what I like. Number one, this is quite a powerful device for being about $100, especially when you compare it to the RG351 devices or something like the RGB10. And this has a very nostalgic design. People like this vertical form factor, and it does look pretty sharp. And like I showed earlier, once you have everything dialed in, PSP and Nintendo 64 performance is really great. I would say you can play 95% of each of those catalogs with no problem. And I would say that if you put in the time, this can become a pick up and play device. It reminds me a lot of the Retroid Pocket 1 and 2 in the fact that many people decided to put the time and effort in, and they really enjoyed the experience once they were done with it. That being said, it does have quite a steep learning curve to get into it in the first place. But the way I see it, if you wanted to do all that setup yourself and then give it to a relative or a friend once it's been properly set up, they would actually have a really great time with it. For example, this could be a device you could give to a kid. It is that easy to use once you have everything set up properly. Okay, so now let's talk about the things I don't like about this device. And there's quite a few here, so we'll take a few minutes with this one. Number one, the rubber coating on this device is just driving me nuts. I really hate having to see all of the oils from my fingers and all the fingerprints all over this device all the time. And it's kind of ironic because in the RGB 10 Max it had the same rubber coating, but it didn't bother me as much. And I think it's because the RGB 10 Max was mostly screen. This thing is not. And so because of that, the fingerprints are just concentrated all over in the bottom of the device and it looks really bad. I also think in the end, this 6-button layout is a very impractical button layout. I mean, even PowKiddy themselves have a diagram on their webpage to show you what each of these buttons are supposed to correspond to. And the way I think about it, if you have to show some sort of diagram like this, that means that your button setup is probably not very good in the first place. And like we've seen in this very long video, it requires a lot of setup and tweaking to get right, and I'm not really sure it's going to be worth your time to do all of that work. And unfortunately, some of these features are either very buggy, like the button mapping software, or broken, like the HDMI out function. And the HDMI out function not working is kind of a shame because this could potentially work as a micro console. You could plug this into a TV, pair a couple Bluetooth controllers, and then just have a night of fun. But unfortunately, the HDMI prevents that from actually happening. And on top of that, like we've shown previously, the stock experience is very limited. You can't see the frame rate, you can't change any of the graphics settings, anything else like that. And so unfortunately, you're going to have to do a lot of tweaking to get everything working properly. You're going to have to install standalone emulators, things like that. And you know, the fact that this thing costs about $100 means it is a fairly cheap device, but unfortunately it's cheap in all the wrong ways too. For example, the mono speaker is very low quality. It really kind of sucks that the analog stick sticks out so much and doesn't press down. This was a problem with the original device and they just kind of carried it over to this one too. And on top of that, the lack of OCA lamination on the screen does make it hard to see the screen if you're not looking straight at it. It has very bad viewing angles. And finally, probably the most frustrating thing about this device is that it really could have been a contender. The processor in it is pretty good, the controls are not terrible, but unfortunately the software experience as well as just some of the other issues we've talked about do make me really hesitate to recommend it. And so in the end, do I recommend this device for purchase? It's really going to depend on a few things. One, do you like the look and the feel of this device? Do you think the form factor is good? And two, are you willing to put in that time to tweak everything to get it working just right? If you're the kind of person who enjoys setting up a device like this and getting it all working just perfectly, then yeah, you might have a good time, especially given the fact that it has pretty dang good performance. But if any of the points I've made earlier give you any hesitation, if you don't like the rubber coating, or the button layout, or you don't want to spend a lot of tinkering, I really wouldn't recommend picking this device up. Even though it has very good Nintendo 64 and PSP performance, I think that if you get a similarly priced device like the RG351V, you're going to have a lot better of an experience. It has mature custom firmware you can use like 351elec or ArcOS, and it also has a large retro community behind the device itself. I honestly don't see this device as taking off as being a viable option, especially when you have cheap and powerful options coming very soon like the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus. So in the end, I think this device has a lot of potential, but it does take a lot of work to unlock that potential. And if you're willing to put that work in, then absolutely go for it. But if not, I would say maybe pass on this one and wait for something that's coming down the line. Anyway, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I appreciate you sticking around. This was a pretty long one. But let me know what you think in the comments below. Is this something you're considering, or is this just kind of a waste of plastic? As always, thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.